At the moment, if we don't find a place, we simply return a 200 response, for example, for P2, with an empty object. We could do that, but I would argue it's not really a success, which a 200 status code indicates, though, if we didn't find anything. I would rather return a 404 error status code, which means the request didn't find any data. For that here, we can check if not place. So if that is falsy, which would be the case if place is undefined, which is the case if we don't find a place here, then I don't want to return this response, but instead a different response where we set a different status code. Now, to set a status code, we can call the status method on the response object. By default, this is set to 200, so we don't need to call it if we want to set it to 200. But we can set it to 404, for example, which would be a standard status code for saying we didn't find anything for the given input. And then we can still call JSON to add some data, and we should do that to then also send the request. And here we could add a message, could not find a place for the provided ID. And that message could be presented to the user later in the front end or in the client we're attaching to this API. Now, one important note, at the moment we would actually introduce a bug here, because here I'm sending a response, and this function execution, of course, doesn't stop thereafter. So this line is also reached after this line executes, so we would send another response, which is not possible and which would therefore cause an error. To work around that, we could either wrap this response in the else block so that only one of the two code snippets executes, or to save that extra code for the else block, simply return here. Not because anyone's interested in the return value of calling JSON, but simply because when we return, no other code thereafter executes. And that's exactly what I want. If we make it in here and we send this response, I don't want this code to execute, so returning here makes sense. With that, if we save this and we try to load a place with an ID that doesn't exist, you see I get this object with message could not find a place for the provided ID. And we also see it's already marked as red here because we got a 404 status code. And that's way better in my opinion. And of course, I want to do something similar here in the other route. I also want to send this response here if we're looking for a user ID which doesn't exist. So here I will say could not find a place for the provided user ID. If we now try this and search for user/u2, I get could not find a place for the provided user ID. If I enter a valid ID, it of course works. The same for my place. If I enter a valid ID here, it also works. Now that's nice, but you can already tell that we're having some code duplication here. We have a very similar check, and the way we send the response is also pretty equal. The only difference is the message. So it would be nice to kind of find a different solution here to have less code duplication. And for that, we can use a feature Express.js has built in, a default error handler. We set this up in app.js and we set it up as a middleware there. Here, we simply add a middleware after our routes middleware. And this middleware here doesn't need a path filter. Instead, we directly add our middleware function, and now it's a special middleware function though. You know the middleware functions with 3 parameters, request, response, and next. This is a middleware function Express will apply on every incoming request. Now, let's tweak this a little bit and let's add a 4th argument, a 4th parameter, which actually is our first parameter here, an error. If you provide a middleware function that takes 4 parameters, Express.js will recognize this and treat this as a special middleware function, as an error handling middleware function. That means that this function will only be executed on requests that have an error attached to it, you could say. So where an error was thrown in the end. So this function, to put it in other words, will execute if any middleware in front of it yields an error. And then in here, we can set up some default error handling code. First of all, we should check if response headers sent is true. That means we check if a response has already been sent. If that's the case, we want to return next and forward the error, which means we won't send a response on our own because somehow we already did send a response and you can only send one response in total. This is a little helper property which helps you check if a response and the headers attached to it has already been sent. If not, so if we make it past this if check, we know no response has been sent yet, and in this case I want to send one now. I want to set a status code on that response, and I want to give the developer of this application, so us in this case, a chance of setting that code on the error object which is thrown in one of the other middlewares. We're not doing this right now, but we're doing it soon. So we'll check if on the error object I'm getting here, if we have a code property and if that is not undefined. If we don't have it, I'll fall back to 500 as a default status code. A 500 code indicates that something went wrong on the server. So either this is set, or if it's false, this value will be used. This is default JavaScript code. And thereafter I'll call JSON. We could also use the chaining syntax I used before to chain it right here. It's up to you. Here I structure it across multiple lines to make it a little bit more readable. And there I want to add an object which has a message property, because every error I send back from my API should have a message property which the attached client can then use to show an error message to their users. That's not a must do, but it's a convention you see a lot in other REST APIs out there, and it is a convention that makes a lot of sense and which I think therefore should be added to our application as well. And here again, I want to check if I have a message on the error object, which I will use and send back if we do have it, and otherwise provide a generic default message of an unknown error occurred. And we'll only use that if there is no message property or an undefined, invalid, falsy value in the message property of the error object. Now that's our error handling middleware. How do we trigger it? We trigger it by doing one of two things. Either here, instead of returning a response, we never do that, either we throw a new error here, or we call next and pass an error to it. Both works. There is one important difference. If you would be in some asynchronous code here, which I'm not here at the moment, but which we later will be when we work with the database, then you have to use the next and pass the error object approach. If you're in a synchronous middleware, as I'm currently here, because we have only synchronous actions, then you can also just throw an error. I'll implement both, one in each function, so that you see both. Later, we'll only work with next error because we will work with asynchronous code. For the moment, we're not doing that. So first of all, let me create an error here though. I will create a new error object, and that already takes a message in its constructor. And here I'll say could not find a place for the provided ID. On that error object, I'll add a code property with the dot notation, simply dynamically adding that property, because here in app.js in the error handling middleware, I'm looking for such a code property. And I'll set it to 404 so that this will be the actual status code which our error handling middleware will send back. And then I can throw that error, and this will trigger the error handling middleware. Now let's copy that here to that second route, and there I will not throw it, but call next to forward it to the next middleware in line, and since I forward an error, it will reach the next error handling middleware in line. And there I will say could not find a place for the provided user ID. If we now save that, and we try a place ID which doesn't exist, you see I get the same object as before, and the same response with a 404 status code. So that works as before, but technically on the backend, it now works in a cleaner, in a better way. Now what you can also tell, however, is for user U2, it does not work. So using next error does not do the trick here. Well, the reason is that I don't return. So that means this code also still executed. That's also why we have an error here on the backend, because more than one response was sent. As I mentioned, you shouldn't do that. So you must not forget to return here. When throwing an error, you don't have to return, because if you use throw, that already cancels the function execution. Next does not cancel it, so we have to return to then thereafter make sure this code doesn't run. And with that, if we now search for an invalid user ID, we also again get our default response. That works, but still, we have some code duplication here in these lines. So we can maybe optimize this even more if we start adding our own error model. Let's do that in the next lecture.